BBC Radio Cumbria for a Friday. By the end of play today, Stuart Hyde's stint as Cumbria's Temporary Chief Constable comes to an end, but what happens next is far from clear. 3 days after the Police and Crime Commissioner Richard Rhodes said he intends to ask Stuart Hyde to retire or resign, no one can tell us whether he's expected at work on Monday, or even who will make that decision. Speaking to BBC Radio Cumbria's Emma Borthwick last night on the News Hour, Stuart Hyde says he's returning to work.
I've made it very clear that I would love to work back in Cumbria. I've given an awful lot to it. I love the place. It's a fantastic place to work. And I can assure you that if given the opportunity to come back to work, I will take that opportunity and deliver as best I can for the people of Cumbria.
Do you see that as an opportunity, going back to work on Monday as Deputy Chief Constable?
If I'm offered the opportunity to come back to work, then clearly I will be doing that. I love the place. It's a fantastic environment. Some lovely people, some great officers and staff, and I'd love to carry on working for Cumbria Police.
Even in the role as Deputy rather than Chief Constable?
There's lots of opportunities within Cumbria, and either would suit.
On Tuesday, Richard Rhodes, the Police and Crime Commissioner, asked you to resign or retire. Do you think he was right to make that request?
Well, actually, I understand that he started a process that could result in him making a decision to ask me to retire or resign. I felt, and I still do feel, that whilst I have some things to learn from the investigation and everything that went with it, that 7 or 8 detectives working for what appeared to be 8 or 9 months, solidly looking at every single thing I'd done over the last few years, had concluded that there was no evidence of misconduct on my behalf, and recommended some management advice, which is the lowest level of conclusion in relation to a number of issues. So I was surprised.
Surprised? Do you think he was right?
I was, as I said, I was surprised and shocked that decision was taken.
Richard Rhodes says you've lost the confidence of senior staff in your ability to run the force. Do you agree with that?
I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Do you feel ganged up on?
I feel that I've provided explanations in relation to a whole host of allegations that have been made, and those explanations have been considered alongside what everybody else has said, and then everything that I've done has been looked at for 8 or 9 months, and the conclusions were quite clear. There was no evidence of any misconduct on my behalf.
Stuart Hyde there. Well, just a reminder, Stuart Hyde was suspended nearly a year ago, but 2 investigations have found no evidence of misconduct. But Richard Rhodes is unhappy about Stuart Hyde's use of a forced credit card, Twitter and foreign trips, and insists there's still a case to answer. Now, the Police and Crime Commissioner, Richard Rhodes, the Temporary Chief Constable, Bernard Lawson, the Chairman of the Police and Crime Panel, Celia Tibble, and the Policing Minister, Damien Green, have all refused our repeated requests for any interviews, which might have helped clarify the situation. But listening to all of this is Paul West. Paul is the former Chief Constable of West Mercia, who now runs the not-for-profit organisation Policing for All, which provides independent advice to PCCs and police and crime panels. He joins me again this morning. Morning to you, Paul.
Good morning again, Richard.
Yeah, we talked a couple of days ago, but this situation is incredibly complex, isn't it? Let's try and unpick it, shall we? Stuart Hyde is Temporary Chief Constable until the 30th of August. That's today.
Yeah.
Then he goes back to being Deputy Chief Constable, but the Police and Crime Commissioner, Richard Rhodes, doesn't have any jurisdiction over the Deputy Chief, does he?
No, that's quite right, and Mr. Rhodes made that clear in the press release that he gave on Tuesday when he announced the suspension that he was enacting. It is very complicated. It's an unprecedented situation, a unique set of circumstances, but I do think I can actually clarify it for you and your listeners this morning. The easiest way to think about it is that Stuart Hyde has been suspended as an individual. Stuart Hyde is currently suspended from duty. The law says, and the law is something called the Police Conduct Regulations 2012, the law says that if there's a material change in circumstances of an officer who is under suspension, then the appropriate authority, and I'll come back to that in a second, somebody called the appropriate authority must undertake a suspension review. Now, the situation today is that midnight tonight, there is a material change in Stuart Hyde's circumstances in that As of today, he's suspended as the Temporary Chief Constable, and as you've quite rightly said, midnight tonight, he reverts to being the Deputy Chief Constable in Cumbria. That's a material change in circumstance which will prompt and must prompt by law a review of his suspension. Now, I mentioned the appropriate authority earlier on, and this is the point that you made about Richard Rhodes, the Commissioner, having no jurisdiction whatsoever over Stuart Hyde as of tomorrow. The Police and Crime Commissioner can call for a Chief Constable to resign or retire under Section 38 of the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act, but has no jurisdiction over Deputy Chief Constables. The appropriate authority in the case of a Deputy Chief Constable is the Chief Constable. That means, and I hope I've explained it reasonably simply, that means that as of midnight tonight, the appropriate authority for making any decisions on Stuart Hyde's future is not Mr. Rhodes, but it's Bernard Lawson, the Temporary Chief Constable, who must, by law, review Stuart Hyde's suspended status, and I imagine he'll be doing that in fairly quick time over this weekend, and then we'll see where we take it from there. And also he will have to make his own independent assessment, and I'm sure he will take good advice on whether he continues to pursue the process that Mr. Rhodes, for some reason, initiated only 3 days before he knew fine well that he would have no locus in pursuing the matter.
Am I right in thinking you helped shape the government legislation around the Police and Crime Commissioners?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. At the time when I was Chief Constable in West Mercia, I was also chair nationally of the Chief Police Officers Staff Association and worked very, very closely with the government in all of this area. It's fair to say that many chief officers had concerns about the checks and balances that were not written into the original draft bill and the draft legislation. And so I was the person who was responsible for ensuring that proper checks and balances, proper safeguards were built in. And some of the procedures that we're talking about now is exactly what I was careful to ensure were put in place. And that's why it's extremely frustrating for me and for many other senior police officers, and I'm sure for many members of the public, just to see police and crime commissioners simply riding a coach and horses through the legislation. It's not a good situation to be in.
The behaviour of Richard Rhodes, though, is overseen by the Police and Crime Panel. It's expected to invite both men to give their side at a hearing this month. Then it'll advise whether Richard Rhodes should ask Stuart Hyde to resign or retire. But isn't that all a bit pointless, because neither the panel nor Richard Rhodes will have any jurisdiction over him by that stage?
You're absolutely right, Richard. Again, it's a strange situation whereby the Police and Crime Panel this week, Richard Rhodes, in his press release on Tuesday, indicated that he had written to them to notify them that he was commencing a process which, had he still had some locus in, they would potentially have had a role to play if it had gone towards a scrutiny meeting at some future date. The fact is, at midnight tonight, the Police and Crime Panel have got no continuing interest in the case whatsoever. So, I'm pleased to hear that they're planning on having some sort of scrutiny meeting at a later date, and I think that should be focused primarily around the actions of Richard Rhodes and some of the decision-making he's been taking. But it certainly will have they'll have no role at all in assessing the status and the future of Stuart Hyde as Deputy Chief Constable, because that clearly is purely the responsibility of the Temporary Chief and the Police and Crime Panel, and effectively any public scrutiny of future decisions completely disappears tonight.
But with all of this going on, we're now in a situation where no one can or will tell us whether Stuart Hyde will be back at work next week or who'll actually be in charge of operational policing in Cumbria from the weekend.
Well, okay, my assessment of that is that Temporary Chief Constable Bernard Lawson will continue in post. There's nothing to suggest anything otherwise. He will be making, as I mentioned earlier on, as he's required to do by law, he will be undertaking a review of Stuart Hyde's suspension, and he will also, in slightly slower time, be considering what to do in relation to the process that Mr. Rhodes initiated 2 days ago and sort of loses any interest in tonight. So the decision around whether Stuart Hyde should continue to be suspended is that of Bernard Lawson. I think it's probably a bit unreasonable to exert too much pressure on him because, this is a slightly crazy situation that's not of his making. It's been rather thrust upon him. I think he needs a bit of time to think, to reflect, to get good advice, which is what, I say in all of these cases. It's crucial that people get good advice and understand the law. And I think your lead into the piece this morning shows that this is complex law. It's unprecedented stuff. Very few people understand it. I do, because I was involved in drafting it and drawing it up in detail with government. But if people who don't understand it simply think they know best and push on in their own particular way, then I'm afraid we get into messes like this which could easily have been avoided.
Paul, thanks very much indeed for helping us put it all into context and work it all out. Paul West, the former Chief Constable of West Mercia, who now runs the not-for-profit organisation Policing for All. We'll have more on this after 8 o'clock. In the meantime, the Police and Crime Commissioner Richard Rhodes, the Temporary Chief Constable Bernard Lawson, and the Chairman of the Police and Crime Panel Celia Tibble have all refused our repeated requests for interviews, as I've mentioned, about this situation. And the Policing Minister Damien Green has also refused our request for an interview.